Created live on Fireside.
Welcome. I'm Lori Lee Binstock, and this is a Trauma Survivor Thrivers podcast. Thank you so much for joining me live on Fireside Chat, where you can be a part of the conversation as my virtual audience. I am your host, Lori Lee Binstock. Everyone has an opportunity to ask me questions, ask my guests questions by requesting to hop on stage or sending a message in the chat box. Today's guest is best-selling author Jeff Romig. But before I want to get started, I do want to mention that if you are in crisis, call the toll-free National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-TALK. They're available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So my guest today, Jeff Romig, he is the best-selling author of Don't Fucking Kill Yourself, which is a memoir about his own experience losing his dad to suicide and how that has affected him. His purpose is to let others know that they are not alone in their struggle and that the only way to eliminate the stigma around suicide is to stop deflecting and start talking. Jeff, thank you so much for joining me today.
Hey, Laura Lee, how are you?
I'm great. Well, I appreciate you coming on. I think this is an extremely important subject. But first, I want to talk about the title of your memoir, which is bold.
Sure.
Don't Fucking Kill Yourself. What was behind choosing the title for this book?
Yeah, it's definitely bold, but it wasn't, there's actually a story behind it. It wasn't just intended to be an eye catcher. About 10 years ago, a friend asked me if I could only say one more thing to my dad, what would I say? And that was my answer because, you know, it's not meant to be edgy. It's not meant to be glib. Suicide is that serious. And, you know, and so for me, that was my answer to that question. And then, you know, through the process of writing the book, which I started in July of 2020, in the pandemic, you know, in the height of the pandemic, it's also a mantra, you know, for people who experience suicidal ideation, and which I do. And still, just because I wrote a book doesn't mean I'm I'm fixed. But yeah, so my book is a memoir, not a self-help book, but I do share sort of three key things. And the first one is to share and share often, about mental health, about suicidal ideation. If you experience that, put yourself out there in the world, because not only will you find that people will reach out to you to support you, but they'll also reach out to you for support, which, you know, helping each other makes us feel valued and whole and hopeful, and you know, can be an antidote to suicidal ideation. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing, which is really sort of the premise of the book, is connect with the people, passions, and experiences that bring you joy. And that phrase was a phrase that didn't, or a concept that didn't really land with me until I had written the first draft of the book. And my first editor kept asking me, like, you know, why are you telling this specific story? In the, you know, the chapters are each based on dates. And so he was like, why are you telling this specific story? And I got really tired of the question. But, you know, obviously editors are amazing, and because they get you to answer hard questions. And, you know, and I really landed on that, you know, the stories I'm telling and sharing are about the people, passions, and experiences from my life, because when I'm in my darkest moments and I'm only about, you know, I'm with myself, and it's tapping into those memories, and that, you know, that perspective, that can really help pull me through the darkest moments. So that's the second thing. And then the last thing is the mantra, don't fucking kill yourself. And if you get to, you know, if you get to that place where you're in your darkest moment, and professional resources are so valuable and so needed, but in those moments, you know, people don't often use them, and they're really at their own, at the mercy of the tools that they have inside of themselves. And so, that's really the core audience for the book, is the people that struggle with suicidal ideation. And, hopefully the best compliment I can get is, your book made me think about this thing with my family, or this thing, you love baseball, but I love dance. And, it's connecting with those things can really help us remember why we are alive, and hopefully that helps us stay alive.
Yeah, you make a good point. I struggled with suicidal ideation frequently. I had several suicide attempts, and it was my last one, which pretty much got me into a treatment center. And yes, it's a struggle. It is a struggle every single day, but I'm learning the tools to try to help me. And so I'm so grateful that you are able to put yourself out there in your own experiences.
And thank you for sharing yours. I'm glad you're doing better. And I think part of this is like, there's the professional resources, which are, again, absolutely needed, and I share them on my website, suicidesurvivalstories.org. But we also have to build sort of a toolbox, sort of a open source toolbox for people who, what are the tools that get you through? What are the tools that get me through? Because, just because these couple of things that I'm saying right now get me through right now, I mean, doesn't mean they will in a year, and so the more that we talk, and the more that we're open, and the more that we share, here's this tip that I, have, or here's this trick that I learned, and we sort of crowdsource this bigger toolbox. I think not only do we help each other, but we create connection, and, with more connection, hopefully there's less ideation.
Mm-hmm. This book came out during the pandemic. Was this your plan? Were you like, I need to get this book out now because there are going to be a lot of people who are going to be struggling with mental health and suicidal ideation, which has been a huge issue. During it'll probably be, post.
Yeah,
I don't know if we're still in it or not.
I don't think, I think in wherever you live right now, it's sort of, do you believe we're still in the pandemic or not? And I'm in Atlanta, and, things are a little looser, and hopefully, it stays that way, and we don't have another, bad variant or whatever. But, so there's actually three answers to that question.
Okay.
The first one is the 25th anniversary of my dad's suicide, was February 24th, 2021. And so, so I started thinking about this, I think sometime in spring of 2020, in like endless Zoom meetings that I was in, or all the different things, Google Chat, Teams, Zooms. It was like one thing after another. And somebody in one of those meetings said something like, if you're a writer and you didn't come out of this time with a book, what were you doing? But on Father's Day of 2021, which was my 25th Fatherless Father's Day, I finished reading a book by Lane Moore called How to Be Alone. And her book really inspired me to sort of dig into this sort of seed of an idea that I had a few years before, but I had more things to go through before I could tell my story. But she inspired me with her book. And so I started writing, and then very quickly I was like, well, I have extra time right now. And the 25th anniversary is coming up in February. So my initial goal was like, can I write this and turn it around fast enough for it to be published around the anniversary? Which, once I figured out what it would actually take, wasn't reasonable. But I did do crowdfunding to fund my project, and I launched that crowdfunding in January of 2021 and ran it through February, to observe his 25th anniversary. And then the book ultimately came out last fall. And so yes, it was the anniversary. It was, I knew that people were struggling more, and it would be a good time. And the third thing is, like, doing this project is what really kept me healthy and helped me get even healthier in the pandemic, because, I was able to not only go into these different places in my mind throughout time, to tell those stories, but I was also able to really focus on doing the work that I needed to do around my trauma, because I think for a long time I mistakenly thought that my grief journey and my trauma journey were synonymous. And the reality, and so I had gotten to a good place in my grief journey, and therefore I assumed I had gotten to a good place in my trauma journey, which was absolutely not the case. And so it was really taking the time to do the dedicated work. When I started writing the book, I hadn't read his suicide letter in, more than a decade. And so, when I got to that part and, sort of had a suicide letter on my end table, reading it and quoting from it as I wrote for, more than a week for that stretch around Thanksgiving in 2020, it just really gave me all kinds of new perspective, because I think one of the things I've learned, not just through this project, but earlier through sobriety, I got sober at the end of 2017, is that our trauma is the constant and we are the variables. So this idea that we're supposed to get over our trauma is, pretty unreasonable, because the reality is that as we grow, we re-experience our trauma through the lens of, the other things we've experienced in age and all of these different variables. So, and the perfect example of this, is my dad's suicide letter. Like, literally, I held this piece of paper in my hand when I was 18 years old, hours after he had died. And I was holding the same piece of paper in my hand, at that time in 2020 as a 42-year-old who was writing this book. And I, reading the same words, the same piece of paper, but through totally different lenses, and different lenses than, the last time I read it, probably when I was around 30, or when I read it in my early 20s in college or whatever. And so, this project really helped me just face off against my trauma, have conversations, with my therapist and with my AA sponsor and other people, with some family that were long overdue, and really have those conversations with myself and just face off against those fears, and, even just the fear of engaging with my own mind. But, I had the time to do it. I'm a nonprofit fundraiser, and so I was doing a lot of work during the day, but, nights and weekends, I had the time to do the work for the book, but to do the work for myself personally, which, has been really great from a personal standpoint, not just because I have a book, to share, but just from where I've grown, as a person. So.
How has and this is probably a very loaded question, how has your father's suicide affected you through the years?
I think, there's kind of a macro answer and a micro answer. I think the macro answer is like, this is the path I've been on, right? Like, I can't, especially when I turned 18 three weeks before my dad died, I can't think of my life as being on a different path. Like, everything I've done as an adult has been through the lens of that trauma. And so, it's really, there's no way to sort of separate it from the rest of my life, It just is so much of who I am, because it happened at such a, moment in my life, where literally 6 months later I left home to go to college. And so pretty much everything as an adult that I've done has been informed, through that trauma. so that's the big picture. But from, from the small perspective, it ebbs and flows. I mean, it's, um, and I think that's where, like, I did a lot of work about 10 years ago on the grief side with a nonprofit here in Atlanta called Kate's Club that works with kids who've lost a parent or a sibling. And, and I really, again, focused on the grief side of things, without really scratching the surface of the trauma part. And so I think there was a lot of unprocessed trauma that was under the surface that played out in my life in other ways. And, and I feel like in the past, now almost coming up on 2 years since I started the book project, I just am in a much better place with that. It doesn't mean it's, it never goes away, but I've learned so much more about myself. And, now I'm dealing with processed emotions around trauma rather than unprocessed. And the difference between those two concepts is, and how they affect my day-to-day life is pretty massive,
Yeah. Did the suicide note give you more closure, or did it give you, I guess, did it cause more questions to bubble up?
No, the biggest thing that surprised me about reading the letter this time is I was really overwhelmed with gratitude. And gratitude is a process, is a concept that I've sort of, and a practice I've developed, since I got sober. I was kind of blindsided by this feeling of gratitude because, like somewhere, and this is, I'm not sure what the actual number is, but, more than 50% of people who lose someone to suicide, that person doesn't leave any sort of a note or answers or letter or anything. Mm-hmm. And so, I think the first thing, having introduced gratitude into my life in a much different way through AA, I was just able to see, like, I might not like these answers, and some of them, I think some of the things he said to me, he was right, and some of them he wasn't right. And I might not like some of his thoughts or where his mind was. I mean, he obviously struggled with the same things that I do, even though he was not diagnosed. And, he was 47 in 1996. And, men of that generation didn't, go to therapy or take meds or anything like that. And so, he was definitely struggling, and I could tell that. But again, I had answers, right? I may not have liked them. And my perspective on those, on what he wrote, obviously has shifted, right? Like, I can look back at some of the things that he was saying to me as an 18-year-old, and be like, yeah, that, he had some good points. I should have listened to some of those things about, like, being more disciplined about my schoolwork and things like that in college. And then other things that he said, like, he was very cynical about the media, the press, and I got a journalism degree and was a newspaper reporter for the first 8 years of my career. And, he didn't really support me fully in that. And, and that still bugs me. Right. And, but again, like, I have this letter that I can go back to, and it was also very different at that time as a 42-year-old. I'm 44 now. And he was 47, to just understand that, like, he was just a guy. Like, he wasn't a superhero, like, I think especially when we're little kids, we think of our parents as, like, these superheroes who have no flaws and can take care of everything. And the reality is like, they're just humans, and they're flawed and they're trying. And, especially when they're navigating their own mental health issues and things like that, like, I think I was just able to see him through this process, as a guy in his 40s who was struggling and wanted the best for his family, but through the lens of his mental health struggles, he was upside down in his thinking, and his logic told him that the only way he could take care of his family is if he died and they got insurance money. And, that logic was very upside down. Um, but but he thought he was doing the right thing. So I don't agree with that, but I have to, in some weird way, I have to respect that was where he was, and as just a human that didn't have any resources, um, to think differently, and that all goes back to why we need to talk, because the more that ideas like that stay in our head and don't leave our mouths, whether it's to friends or to a therapist or on social media or a combination of all those things, they just turn into poison.
Yeah.
And, the suicidal ideation just becomes poison. And that's what I believe happened to him, is that, I mean, I got my diagnosis of clinical depression and generalized anxiety, which obviously millions of other people have. I'm not special, but I got that diagnosis back in 2002. I mean, it was 6 years between the time he died and the time I was diagnosed. Even though I struggled with all those same things in that time and even before he died, now I can see that. But it's been 20 years with my diagnosis. I've been with my same therapist for 15 years, like same meds for a long time, relatively stable. And depression kicks my ass all the time. Like it's, and suicidal ideation and anxiety, like these things are things that I struggle with every single day, like so many people. But to think about him as a 47-year-old who had probably struggled with the same things for just as long, but had no treatment and no outlet and only what was in his head, like it sounds totally unbearable, right? So, like, I have to be able to find that empathy for him as a human. I think for so long I just saw myself as a victim of his decision. And, I think I've, because of the tools of sobriety, especially, I, and through the project and the personal work that I did, around the book, I've been able to find just so much more compassion for him, and it's one of those, like I've never really liked the concept of like I can forgive you, but I'll never forget kind of thing. It's like, to me, those seem pretty intertwined. And if you're remembering it, are you really forgiving? But I think with this, like, I think I have, like, obviously, I'll never forget my dad himself or that last decision he made. But I have forgiven him, and I understand as a guy in his mid 40s who struggles with, these mental health challenges, like I understand how hard it must have been, and even I also can't understand how hard it was in that time in the world, um, with no tools,
Yeah.
and so that's kind of where I've come.
Mm. You also talk in your book, and you also contributed to Authentic Insider, which I'm so grateful for.
Yeah,
You
thank you for
talk
the opportunity.
absolutely. You talk about your curiosity of what was he thinking in those
Hmm.
final moments, and that kind of consumed you to the point. What was he thinking? How how did that consume you? And what have you learned from just that
Yeah, I'm going to
idea?
change your word. It's
Yes, please.
haunted. It haunted me. I think that's the better word,
Mm,
because it wasn't something that was constant, but it was something that I came back to. So it was definitely something that kind of haunted me over time. Um, but and that was the seed of the idea of the book, right? In those minutes between when he closed the door to the car and started it, he did the carbon monoxide in the car thing. Um, before he lost consciousness, like what was he thinking, and why wasn't it enough to stop? I think that was my thought. Um, and you combine that with with the, the concept we've all heard forever that your life flashes before your eyes, when you die or when you're about to die, life, death, or near death experience kind of lore.
Mm-hmm.
And so the seed idea for the book was not only what was he thinking about, but what would I see from my life if my life flashed before my eyes. And so that was sort of um, the concept of the book of, it's every chapter is based around a date, and it's told in a non-linear fashion because obviously um, our lives wouldn't pass before our eyes chronologically, I don't believe. And so, so it's definitely a book that plays with time. And, it jumps around, but, I think we did a good job of organizing it in a way that it's not disorienting. But also, you jump from 2004 to 1999 to 2015, but that's how our memories work, right? That's how our memories think about time. Like they're, in the same way that in our dreams, like things aren't linear. And so our minds play with time. And so that's where I wanted to organize the book that way, sort of based on that original, what was he thinking at the time kind of thing, because I think that also in the way that our minds play with time, our social, suicidal ideation minds want to rob us of the positive memories, right?
Yeah.
So we
Mm-hmm.
have to be way more intentional about how we remember things. And I think that's where, this book about my life is really about time and how we experience time and how we experience memory and how we tap into those memories again in order in our darkest moments to connect with the perspective we need to remember what's truly possible. And again, like this concept and this tool that I'm putting out there is not a silver bullet. Like it may not help everybody, but I hope it helps some people, and it definitely has helped me. I mean, on November 29th, 2017, on the closest I've been to suicide, it was exactly that, thinking about my family and thinking about, you know, some happier memories that helped me get over that hump and get me to the next morning where I was able to reach out to my college roommate and say, I need help. I feel like I'm suicidal, but more than anything, I feel like I have a problem with alcohol. And he'd been sober since 2001. And, I wanted to talk to him. And, that bridge was enough to get me talking and then to the resources I need to get sober, which brought me a whole new set of tools that has helped me, you know,
Survive.
survive. And,
Mm-hmm.
I think I've gotten good at surviving, but I'm working on how do I get from surviving to thriving,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's nonlinear, right? We have those days, and you made a great point by saying, when we are in the suicidal idea, this idea where we want to kill ourselves or we want to attempt suicide, everything's negative. It's so hard to fish for the
Yeah.
positive and be grateful. But the thing is, you made a good point. If you are able to pull out what you're grateful for every single day, it'll come easier when those moments arrive when you're like, I just can't do this anymore.
Yeah.
So
And
I
I do
think
want to make a
that's great.
distinction for the audience that being suicidal and having suicidal ideation are not synonyms. It's
Mm-hmm.
a spectrum. And, I thought for a long time that if I was thinking about suicide, then I was suicidal and therefore I'm crazy. And that can get you on this sort of spinning that only exacerbates the problem, right? But to me, suicidal ideation is one end of the spectrum, and when it starts to spin out of control is when you get to being suicidal. So,
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to think about suicide in lots of different ways, right? My dad died by suicide. Like, it's not unhealthy to think about suicide when there's danger and you're making a plan and someone is actively suicidal. That's the place that someone needs help at that moment. And the biggest reason that I'm saying this is that a lot of people don't share about suicidal ideation because they are worried that the person they're sharing to is going to overreact. And
Mm-hmm.
so, if you and therefore they don't share, and therefore it becomes poison. So if you're in a position where you can support a friend, you have to look at what's happening and know that, first off, it's not about you. So if your friend is talking calmly and explaining things to you, and you know and there's not danger, don't create danger, right? But if
Mm-hmm.
if if your friend is like spinning and saying, I'm planning to do this, and there is like clear and present danger that is genuine and not about you being scared, then obviously, like, help them in whatever way they need to be helped. But I think if we want to lower the stigma around talking about suicidal ideation, we have to make sure that when we're being supportive as friends, that we're not projecting onto people danger that might not be there yet, because there is a spectrum. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So
Um,
that's one thing. Those are a couple of things that I've tried to be intentional about sharing. Which aren't things those things aren't in my book. But just as I'm talking and sort of trying to advocate a little more for people to talk more about suicidal ideation, um, you have to think about the reasons why people don't. And I think one of those is like, well, if I tell someone that I'm thinking about suicide, they're gonna like put me in a car and take me to a mental institution, right? And who wants that? And that doesn't mean that some people, when they get to the point of being suicidal, that's what they need, right? But the fear of that keeps people silent, and therefore can create more poison, which creates more suicides.
yeah. I feel like for me, as a child, I was suicidal at a very early age. I had suicidal ideation, but like you said, I didn't want to talk about it. It was terrifying. I went
Mm-hmm.
from there to my first attempt. And I don't think it was that I wanted to die. I think I
Mm-hmm.
wanted help. I just didn't
Yeah,
know how to ask for it. Um,
totally.
but I think another problem was, people are like, oh, well, they just want attention. Honestly, yes, maybe they do. I think they need someone to attend to what is happening, um, in their lives. For
Mm-hmm.
me, after I think I was crying out for help, and I thought maybe I'd be taken to a hospital. Maybe something would. I actually wanted to be taken to a hospital.
Yeah.
That's how serious it was. But my parents, they just hoped for the best, and they didn't take me anywhere. They didn't want to take me to see a therapist.
Mm-hmm.
Um and that was traumatic in and of itself. But I think when someone is coming to you and saying, I don't want to live anymore, we really need to listen.
Yeah.
And I want to, how do we talk to, especially children nowadays? They're just in my daughter's school, there was a 13-year-old who committed suicide. It was
Mm-hmm.
terrible. It was awful. um and you know how do should we be bringing this up? Should we be talking about it in schools? What are your thoughts about that? If as someone who is an advocate for having these difficult discussions, how do we start those discussions when maybe somebody's not even feeling suicidal, or maybe there is somebody we just don't know?
Yeah. I mean, I think that it's one of those things where I think the fear of talking about it on kind of the adult side, when we're talking about teenagers, and I used to run a nonprofit for teenagers, so I had a little experience there. Um, we're worried that if we talk about it, then we're giving them ideas, right? But I think the reality is that if you create a space of open dialogue, you're more likely to lead to healthy outcomes than you are to lead to unhealthy outcomes. That doesn't mean that there won't be unhealthy outcomes, right? Like it's not a zero sum game, and I mean that's why it's, I've never heard anyone say the phrase suicide eradication, right? Like in suicide prevention, we're trying to prevent suicide, but the reality is that if we go about it as if we're trying to, eliminate all suicide, which isn't reasonable, right? Like there are things that are going to happen, and you just that's just probability, right? I mean, and we have to face the reality of the situation is that like we're, um, more kids will be, and more people in general will be in more danger without dialogue and engagement, than they would be if we engage, right? Because for a lot of people that experience suicidal ideation, it is that lack of connection. It is that lack of engagement, that is part of it, right? Because like you said, a lot of folks don't want to die. They just don't want to live the way they're living, and they want help and they want support, And so it's like, and it's different, it's nuanced, and it's different for every person. And it's just one of those things that we can't, again, there aren't silver bullets. There's not a panacea. We can't just do one thing and say, here are these 5 tools that are going to work until the end of time. Like it's an evolving thing, how it is to be a teenager now with social media and everything that it's nonstop, we're at least like, I was a teenager in the 90s, and it was like, at least we got to turn off high school when we went home, whereas like it's all consuming for them, and therefore there have to be different tools, and in 10 years we'll have to have another set of new tools, right? And so it can't be something that we can just set up and not engage with. There has to be intentionality. There has to be conversation, and to focus on, well, we did all this and this still happened, so we shouldn't talk about it anymore, right? It's like it's not reasonable from a probability standpoint, from a logic standpoint. And so if the thing that leads to healthier outcomes is more dialogue, then we should engage in more dialogue. That's my take.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's safe to say that if someone comes to you saying that they don't want to live, they don't like their life, that we should absolutely engage with compassion and empathy, 100%. So
yeah, and look, I like over 20 years since I got first diagnosed in 2002, like the stigma around talking about mental health has shifted massively in 20 years. But even still, until I was a couple months into writing the book, as much as I had shared on social media and stuff about mental health and, had these open conversations about anxiety and depression, I had never said suicidal ideation out loud on social media until I was already writing the book. And I was like, okay, if I'm going to be an advocate for this, like I have to start sharing too. And so, I make sure not to just say anxiety and depression, but say suicidal ideation, and make sure that, that's part of the conversation too.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Is there anything that you would like to add?
Yeah, like I said, I think the three things, that are sort of the takeaways from the book. I hope I wrote a book that's a good memoir that people, um, can enjoy, or if they don't struggle with suicidal ideation, I hope it can give them insights on their loved ones that do. And then, of
Mm-hmm.
course, for the core audience, I hope that it, gives them some tools and helps them feel like they're not alone. But yeah, the main thing is just back to those three things: share and share often. You know, be intentional about connecting with the people, passions, and experiences of your life that bring you joy through your memories. And then, don't fucking kill yourself.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you joining me today.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And if you are in crisis, I want to mention this again. You can call the toll-free National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-TALK. That's 1-800-273-8255. They're available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Jeff, he is the author of Don't Fucking Kill Yourself. For more on Jeff, you can go ahead and click on that fortune cookie. You can also visit my website at tstpodcast.com. That's the letter A, tstpodcast.com. He has contributed to February's issue of Authentic Insider, which you can find at my website. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to my email list to get Authentic Insider magazine in your inbox monthly. Next week, we are taking a break, but when we come back the following week, that would be Thursday, April 21st, we go live with energy healer and mindset coach, Amanda Monnier. You've been listening to a Trauma Survivor Thrivers podcast on Fireside Chat. I'm Lori Lee Binstock. Thank you so much for being a part of the conversation. Take care.